Hi, welcome to the bathtub. I've been trying to do this musical intro, which I've screwed up over and over again. I figured out how to do it. So hold on. Tweety Bird came out really poorly the last time, so I'm going to play it a little better. This is a technical sophistication. I take the microphone and I put it next to the speaker, and you should be able to hear. This is my favorite line. I love that song. Life is full of hope in the bathtub. That's the whole thing about the whole purpose of these stupid talks is that we feel good in the morning. We read books. This is the show that tries to eliminate any sort of educational aspect from books. So all the idiots that want to tell me how to pronounce things and what the meaning of literature is, I get these idiots all the time. Go play your bassoons. We don't care about what literature means. We're just reading books in the bathtub. And if you can't hack it in the bathtub, you can't hack it anywhere. That's my personal philosophy. So today, I'm kind of doing another impromptu sort of. I didn't mean to do another one this week, so I'm a little bit backed up. We're going to talk about Arthur Machen, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But I'm saying Machen. The Three Impostors. I just read this for the first time in my life this past few days in the bathtub, and I think it's an incredible book. And I want to talk a little bit about Arthur Machen. We're going to be talking a lot about Machen in the next few months because I'm doing kind of a longish project trying to get to understand his work. And I think he's a really interesting, underrated writer. So this is still a Manhattan from the last one. So I take it quite slowly. And I can do 3 or 4 talks with one Manhattan. So don't think I'm some lightweight. When I first moved to London 35 years ago, I lived in London for many years until recently. We moved to San Luis Obispo. And one of the first books that I read when I went there, the first time I got to London, I was like in my late 20s. I'd never traveled. And I liked to walk. I used to walk all over Los Angeles. I was like the characters in the Ray Bradbury story. The police were always driving along beside me, wondering why I was walking. And when I went to London, it's the world for walkers. It's the land of walking. And it's the land of aimlessly walking. And I loved London just for that. And I will probably always consider it my favorite city in the world, particularly when I got there in the mid-'80s. It was still old Victorian. Lots of it was still old Victorian. London was still there. And the sort of characters that you would see walking around and the whole shape of the city and the people in the city and the way it was run. It was very provincial in its own ways. It was kind of closed-minded in its way. This was before EU came through. And it was a really peculiar city that was just delight to walk through because you just never stop seeing things. And one of the first books I read was Arthur Machen's The London Adventure. And my friends the Klutz told me about it, and I picked it up somewhere. I don't remember how I found a copy, some beat-up old copy, and I read it in my first weeks in London. And it was such a wonderful book that basically was telling me what I had felt from the moment I got to London. And I basically spent the next 35 years walking all over London almost every day, miles and miles. I don't think a day went by I didn't go walking. And it was always a different experience. I walked my dog through London. It was just a great place to walk. So I hadn't read the book, and I thought of Arthur Machen basically from this book. I didn't know any of it. He's better known as a horror or as an early weird tales writer. His most famous book is called The Great God Pan. I just read this recently, this past week. So I just read that. And our old friend S.T. Joshi, Joshi, I get it wrong, right? We really enjoy his books now at Penguin. He did a nice collection, as usual, of Arthur Machen's work. And it's a good collection of just general stories. It doesn't have The Great God Pan in it, but it's a good book to get. And so recently I've been reading Machen's more conventional work, the work he's known by, which is these kind of horror stories and fantastic stories. The Great God Pan is a very interesting book, which I only just read. I'd heard about it for years. There you'll see the illustration in this kind of nice Penguin edition was by Beardsley for John Lane Publishers. And Machen came in at the end of the Decadent period. So he came in with Oscar Wilde and all the decadents and the Beardsleys and the Dowsons and all the people who were kind of famous for walking around with the green carnations and the people who the dandies of late 19th century London, writers who were influenced by a man named Walter Pater. I'm really interested in that period. And they basically believed in elegant, beautiful prose, however, and kind of a orchid-like, rank, kind of a unsavory aspect. And anything that was beautiful was good. And even if it was unpleasant and kind of erotic and perhaps unsocial. So unsocial. They didn't mind behaving in a bad way as long as it was beautiful. And that was sort of the Oscar Wilde's reputation. When Machen published The Great God Pan, which is basically two stories, The Great God Pan is about a scientist who unlocks an ability in a young girl's brain to see everything, to see the world of nature in its ugliness and its beauty at once. And what happens to this girl after she's been released from the inhibitions of her culture and of her own brain. It's a very strange, brilliantly constructed story. And there's another story in the original book, the title of which I think is called The Inner Light. So these are kind of a number of ways of just saying that Machen published this book, The Great God Pan, when he was a young man. He attracted the attention of Oscar Wilde, who was just out of prison, I believe, or coming out of prison, and whose life was ending who was really falling apart after this kind of tragic end of this illustrious, famous, celebrated character, and he was kind of at the end of his life, just falling apart. And he really liked Machen's work, as he should have, because The Great God Pan has all the beauty and elegance and disturbing qualities of the great Dorian Gray novel. If you haven't read Dorian Gray, you must read Dorian Gray. Same sense of prose and aesthetic sensibility and just kind of a love for sentences and beautiful sentences. Both like Wilde, he was influenced by another guy who I'm going to mispronounce, Aribor, Against the Grain, also publishes Against Nature by Huysmans. I'm pronouncing this wrong, but Huysmans was a French writer, big inspiration of the decadence. Very peculiar books about Satanism and evil, and like Dorian Gray, this evil flowering in these kind of beautiful, beautiful speeches and talks and beautiful set pieces. Okay, now the Machen was not an evil man. He was a very kind of middle class married guy. He was an artist, and he was a bit odd. And I think believe he was fairly religious, but he had sort of mystical opinions. And I don't want to go into those because I don't know him yet. But after he wrote The Great God Pan, he wrote a second book. And it was called The Three Impostors. And this book came out just as Wilde's reputation was crashing, and just as this whole decadent sensibility was crashing. And it was very unpopular. And when the Three Impostors originally came out, and I don't know, very late 1800s, just before Wilde died, it just didn't no one bought it, and it got badly reviewed. And you can sort of see it's a kind of a nasty and beautiful book. That's the best way I could describe it. Nasty and beautiful. It was published. It had gone through various permutations and various small published in various guises over the years. And then in the 70s, the great editor Lynn Carter, we talked about these when I talked about the Ballantines. He published this amazing series called the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series. I've shown you these before. In the early 70s, you ever see these? In Britain there was a kind of a ripoff, not a ripoff, but they did their own version of some of these same covers. Again, the wraparound covers. I think this is Bob Pepper. And in the course of it, he published Lynn Carter, who was a notoriously awful writer. Just an awful. You can almost not read a sentence of his prose, his fiction prose. Wrote these lovely introductions to all these writers that no one had ever heard of in America at the time, and I never heard of. And he sort of he brought back into he introduced to new generations of readers people like James Branch Cabell, and Arthur Machen. All right, this is now I think one of the more rare books in the Ballantine series. And if you find this copy, definitely get it. It hasn't been published in paperback properly in the past 50 years, except for perhaps this one edition, and there may have been a second edition of it. It's a very short book. It's about 150 pages. In this book, Lynn Carter added an extra story which features some of the characters. And I want to say very briefly what this book is about. It's very confusing to read. I tried reading it many times over many years and could not get into it, because the opening prologue is about three people walking somewhere, and they have three different names, and we don't know where they are really, and they're just sort of talking about how they're going to go off and do some work. And then it ends, and it's kind of hard to know what's going on. Then after the prologue, there's something called The Adventure of the Gold Tiberius. There's a deliberate reference to Sherlock Holmes, The Adventure of such and such. It's very, very, very comic undermining of the whole Sherlock Holmes narrative, where you solve problems. Basically, things just get worse, more and more out of hand in the course of this book. This story introduces two more characters, and one of them goes out. So I would say the first 10 pages of the Three Impostors is incredibly confusing. Take it slow, because then what it turns into is a very mini Arabian Nights. It's a series of stories. We meet basically three different characters, or more than three characters, and each of the characters we meet tells us a story. Most of the stories are macabre. Some of them are really horrific and macabre. Some of them are sort of funny, and they all feature these two characters, one of whom's name is Dyson, who Dyson himself does not believe science answers questions. So there's two personalities in the book. One is that science solves problems and examines things and understands them. The other is that no matter how hard you stare at things, there's a mystical aspect to the world that we can never really explain. That is the Machen persona throughout his career, this notion that there's a mystical quality to the world. In the course of these little narratives, they move along. You meet these different characters, and I'll be honest, as you're moving along, you say, oh, this is good, and it becomes a little bit confusing. And then near the end of the book, all of this stuff comes together. And the story, the opening, where we find this coin, and the very prologue, we meet these three people, the three, quote, imposters, comes to a conclusion in which a man suffers a kind of a horrific fate, and the whole book closes on you. I mean, it's one of those few times I remember feeling when you get to the end of a book, the doors close and you're in it. And it's a creepy, funny, beautiful book with a horrific closing. So it really is a kind of horrific novel, but it's absolutely beautiful. So there's been a lot of mixed feelings about this book. Many people think there's passages that shouldn't be in it, or some passages are better than others. I honestly think this is by itself, just the Three Impostors, that 150-page, very short novel, is a real beautiful book. And I just wanted to get back on, talk about this a bit today, and read it. Let me read one little passage, because my favorite part of Machen is the way he describes the kind of mystical experience of being in London and walking through London, which we'll talk about when we go through other of Machen's books. And this is described about, he's lost out in the suburbs. I think he's out near Enfield or somewhere like that. And he's he has to walk to Waterloo Bridge because of the buses have stopped. I can't tell you how many times in London I would be off 8-10 miles from home in the center of London, and I'd end up walking, because back when when the tubes we used to run short and the buses were never running, I remember getting in this position. Before me was the long suburban street, its dreary distance marked by rows of twinkling lamps, and the air was poisoned by the faint, sickly smell of burning bricks. It was not a cheerful prospect by any means, and I had to walk through 9 miles of such streets, deserted as those of Pompeii. I knew pretty well what direction to take, so I set out wearily, looking at the stretch of lamps vanishing in perspective, and as I walked, street after street branched off to right and left, some far-reaching to distances that seemed endless, communicating with other systems of thoroughfare, and same mere protoplasmic streets, beginning in orderly fashion with serried 2-storied houses, and ending suddenly in waste and pits and rubbish heaps, and fields whence the magic had departed. It does feel in large parts of the suburbs of London like the magic has left a few centuries ago. I have spoken of systems of thoroughfare, and I assure you that, walking alone through these silent places, I felt fantasy growing on me, and some glamour of the infinite. There was here, I felt, an immensity, as in the outer void of the universe. I passed from unknown to unknown, my way marked by lamps like stars, and on either hand was an unknown world where myriads of men dwelt and slept, street leading into street, as it seemed to world's end. He's a beautiful writer, and he writes beautifully about this experience of going through London. And I'm looking forward, one of these days we'll reread The London Adventure. It's just basically, it's about walking, and the key to walking in London is not to be going anywhere. You don't, if you're trying to go somewhere, don't just take the tube. You just walk. You have no idea where you're going, and every time you go somewhere, it's an adventure. And he writes beautifully about the area of King's Cross, where I spent most of my life in London. Okay, that's went longer than normal, but I really, really recommend this. This was a real thrill. Again, I think I mentioned I was never a big fan of horror fiction, and tried reading this many times over the years because I love the book itself, and I like the series that Lynn Carter edited. But when I did finally crack it and get through to the end of it, I think that's a really special book. And if you could find this edition, great. It's very expensive, I think, online. But there's other editions, and Tartarus and Hippocampus, I think, as well, are both have brought out new editions of the Three Impostors, and you could possibly in Kindle. I know Tartarus has the Three Impostors on Kindle as part of another book. Okay, we'll see you soon, and you would really have a kick if you like if you get the Three Impostors. Excuse me. Where can you get belching and masturbating in the exact same lecture? Okay, bye.